watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Saturday afternoon. I'm really excited to say that we have Father and Dr. Richard Price, returning guest, talking about the Council of Ephesus. Many of y'all know he is a renowned translator and historian. Here is the translation that he did of the Council of Ephesus of 431. He's done many other translations, as I'm sure most of us already know, not only of other ecumenical councils, but also some other councils that are not necessarily ecumenical, but are incredibly important. So, welcome back to the show, Dr. Price.
Thank you.
Let me welcome you. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Really excited to have you on, and I'm really looking forward to this. The Council of Ephesus. Where do we begin? Let's maybe start with what exactly led to the calling of the Council of Ephesus. What were some of the events that led up to that?
I'm sure some of the people watching will know most of this already. They'll have a good picture in their mind of the setting. But for the benefit of others, I just like to make a very general introduction. See, where was the church at this date? 430, 431. In Ephesus, of course, at the west of Asia Minor. Now, we've got the Roman world is divided politically between two emperors, one in Italy in the west, and then the emperor of the east, the Balkans, the Near East, Egypt, residing in Constantinople. As regards the church, the leaders in the East were the later called patriarchs, some of them already, of Constantinople, not yet officially a patriarchate, but obviously it's the imperial capital. The bishop there has a big role. And then there's Alexandria, the most prestigious and the most powerful see in the East, with the provinces of Egypt being very obedient to him. And then Antioch in Syria is the other important see that really comes into this. Now, they got themselves involved in a pretty ferocious doctrinal dispute over the exact nature of Christ. A dispute between Nestorius, who was from Syria, but had been made Bishop of Constantinople, and Cyril, Patriarch of Alexandria. Now, we talk about Christ being conceived in the womb of Mary and born of her. But to that, precisely what are we talking about? Now, Nestorius, like in fact the Syrian bishops too generally, refused to make God the Word the second person of the Trinity, the personal subject of his human experiences, since it doesn't seem to make sense to say God was conceived in the womb or God was born of Mary, which seemed to them meaningless or blasphemous. One has to say Jesus Christ was conceived by Mary and born of her. And at the same time, we'll say that although the human nature is in a way a distinct subject, nevertheless, the manhood was joined to the Godhead together in union. Now, against that, Cyril of Alexandria claimed that this position was a denial that Christ is God. It's separating Christ the man from the second person of the Trinity. So he responded to Nestorius with his famous 12 anathemas, of which the 12th is particularly, well, they all stand out. 12th is particularly telling. Runs, the word of God suffered in the flesh and was crucified in the flesh and died in the flesh. This seemed to the Syrians to be blasphemous nonsense. And it was not yet widespread common theology. Now, when we get to Chalcedon 20 years later, 451, Cyril was treated by everybody as being, the greatest writer about Christ, treated with huge respect, even by the Syrians of that council. But the council completely ignored the 12 anathemas, and it did not reproduce its teaching in its own definition. There was still a sense of embarrassment and awkwardness about them. Only in the 6th century was it generally accepted, not quite accurately, that the Council of Chalcedon had given its approval to these anathemas. Of course, this raises a big question. What do we mean by God died on the cross? Does that make sense? Speaking as a believing Christian, for me, that is terribly important. When one faces the problems of life, the terrible suffering on our world with COVID and now with the fighting in the Ukraine, how can you reconcile that to the love of an omnipotent God? And for me, the answer, well, I don't think there is a sort of rational answer, but for me, the great comfort is the sense that God is with us in all this. He has united himself to our suffering. So I think this is hugely, I find this, it's absolutely central in my own faith. But there is a problem of how, as a theologian or a metaphysician, you're going to make sense of it.
So what would you say was the council's main focus? I know they dealt with a lot of different issues, but what was the main central theme to the council?
Well, sorry, before that, I'd just like to say a word about, we call this the Third Ecumenical Council. What is meant by an ecumenical council? Now, nowadays we think of Vatican II or something, and we think of a council that is bishops come to from the whole Catholic world, and that's essential for it being ecumenical. But this was not what was understood in drawing those 7 councils from the 4th to the 8th century. For them, the key thing was that the councils were summoned by the emperor. Now, the emperor was regarded as God's viceroy on earth. Indeed, in the 7th century, one meets an expression that I find quite bizarre, that God is the emperor's co-emperor. As Constantine already claimed this, that God has entrusted all earthly things to my concern. So what made a council ecumenical is that it was summoned by the emperor as an imperial council, and at the end of it, it was the emperor who published the decrees. And it didn't matter that in practice, the bishops were from quite a limited geographical range. Now, what about the West? Was the Western Church represented? It was, in a sense, these councils, those virtually always papal legates were there present. That was important for them. But they were there not representing the Western Church as a distinct geographical area. They were there representing the Pope, who everybody recognized was the number 1 bishop. And there were very few bishops attended any of these ecumenical councils from outside in the East, outside the territory of the Byzantine Empire. Well, until, loss to the Arabs of Palestine and Egypt, and they still sent representatives to councils. Now, in the case of Ephesus, there's a particular curiosity because there were the council's bishops all summoned. The emperor intended they'll all meet together and come to a common mind, but they didn't meet together. Cyril opened the council with the majority of the bishops there on his side before the Syrians arrived. The Syrians arrived and set up a rival council. They were having one city, Ephesus, 2 rival councils going on, attacking and condemning each other. Strictly speaking, the council never properly met. Now, after the council, the Syrians came, the Cyril's council, which wasn't certainly the majority one, condemned Nestorius, and the Syrians came to accept that condemnation, which means a gradual acceptance by everybody of this council as ecumenical, and that is standard by the time we reach Ephesus in 451. But the problem remains for us, can we really call this council ecumenical when it never properly met? The bishops never properly met together.
And when you say the bishops never properly met together, can you maybe just briefly expand on that?
Well, bishops meeting together means they meet together and discuss together and debate together and vote together. When you've got the council splits into 2 parts that anathematize each other, That's a pretty funny as
Yeah.
as an ecumenical council. And the emperor, I mean, I said the ecumenical council is in a sense an imperial council, and the emperor Theodosius II never ruled. He never said, this, I count this council as, this half of it is genuine and the other is not. No, he though accepted some of the decrees of the Cyrilium, the majority council, he never made any ruling as to which of the council really had his full backing and authority.
And so the main focus of the council doctrinally, can you just briefly summarize that for us?
Well, I've mentioned that there was that the chief issue was this fierce controversy between Cyril of Alexandria and his supporters and Nestorius, John of Antioch, and their supporters. Palestine, Egypt was behind Cyril, Syria behind John and Nestorius. The rest of the, Asia Minor and Europe, the bishops were in fact very divided. I say they never met together. Could I say a word about, because this is important, about the documentation of the council, which is unique, because the council never met together as a single body, and the emperor never accepted one or other of these two rival councils, the proper one. Unlike all the other ecumenical councils, the acts and decrees were not issued by the emperor as imperial law. And there was never a single official body of the material published. But because, Chalcedon, after Chalcedon, continuing debate, controversy, people were very interested in Ephesus. And so various rival collections of documents were made, and quite a number of separate ones. And putting these all together is a bit of a problem. Now, the great edition of the Greek and in some cases Latin text was done by Eduard Schwarz in Berlin in the 1920s. But his edition is extraordinarily difficult to read because he doesn't rearrange the material chronologically. He takes each document collection as a separate body, and even within those document collections, chronological order is not observed, and most of the documents don't have a date attached to them. So working through the material in his edition is really an uphill task, and the great majority of historians have not made the attempt. I mean, when they meet a reference to a document in Schwarz, they look at it. But struggling through Schwarz is something that they don't have the time to do. And this is why I can see you've held up a copy of my edition. Now, this is a translate. Now, I arranged. The material which comes in these collections extends well beyond 431, but to make it manageable and keep to the council proper, Thomas Graumann, my collaborator, and I kept to the necessary material before the council met, and then what went on at the council right till it was dissolved finally by the emperor in October 431. It starts in June 431. So yes, we didn't, even though we didn't include everything, we didn't include all the sermons, we didn't include theological dispositions and theological tracts. We kept to the records of sessions, which are very far from complete, and a huge correspondence. Now, this is the great value of the Acts of Ephesus, with a huge number of letters relating to the council, bishops at it writing to Constantinople, lobbying to get support in the capital, or writing to their home provinces. This is a huge amount of documentation, which we do not have for any of the other ecumenical councils. And in this way, although the Acts of Ephesus are so in one sense incomplete, they are a fascinating record. And the leading, I think you'd say, British historian of the Roman Empire of the last generation, Sir Fergus Miller, found this material fascinating. And he said, now he would be in position to know this, which I'm not, that the Council of Ephesus, of all events in Roman history, is the one about which we know most. So I think these acts have huge interest, not just for church history, but of a whole understanding of how politics worked at this period in the Roman Empire, how people lobbied government, lobbied officials, appealed to the emperor and so forth, and the pressures on the emperor, strong pressures in Constantinople with rival factions there, whipping up crowds. So it's a very exciting story. So what Thomas Grauman and I have done is produce, omitting a lot of the purely theological material, a sequence of documents in chronological order with a full commentary that I think, tells the story. And I think, I trust our work will be found useful by people who actually want to get beyond the standard remarks in church histories, which all too often have not been based on an extensive reading of the source material.
Yeah. And you've mentioned here the emperor, and we know he historically had a pretty vital role when it comes to the ecumenical council. So can you maybe speak to what role did he play specifically at Ephesus during the council?
Well, of course, both sides appealed to him. So there he was in his simplicity. He'll get the bishops together and they'll sort it out. But, I mean, the fool, he didn't ask himself who's going to chair this council. I mean, now later councils are often chaired by high-ranking imperial officials, but he sent a comparatively junior representative to Ephesus and told him not to interfere with the doctrinal debate. Now, of the bishops there, the two people who are most, accepted as being a sort of roughly speaking at the top of the Roman legates, of course, are regarded as the most senior, but they arrived very late, only when already the council had split up into two and condemned each other. So their presence wasn't decisive. Cyril of Alexandria, very important, but of course the Syrians won't accept him chairing the council, and the Egyptians, their allies, won't accept Nestorius chairing the council. So it was a hopeless situation. So it really, I mean, the emperor, as I say, he made a mess of it. He should have, as the late, now after that, emperors are much more careful. They dictate the agenda. Sometimes they quite openly dictate the decisions the council has got to come to. Now, of course, we nowadays think this is improper, but remember, the emperor is chosen by God to keep the church orthodox. So, I mean, he was recognized. No, he couldn't sort of himself, well, I'd say he couldn't. Well, the Emperor Justinian was a highly competent theologian, and he issued theological works, but still, those weren't imperial laws. But it was the emperor's task to assist the bishops, tell them what their task was, and it's the bishop's job to fulfill this. And what Theodosius should have done is to, as I say, appoint a senior or body. You see, Chalcedon, all the sessions they've won were chaired by quite a number of high-ranking imperial officials, and they told the bishops what they had to do. And when there was a dispute, the bishop was uncertain, the emperor was consulted, and he'd send directions that would be followed. But I said the emperor Theodosius didn't make a good job of it. Not interesting too, I've already mentioned the lobbying that he was subject to. During most of this council, he was hostile to Cyril, who he thought of stirring up trouble, just as a bit of a power grab. And she remained. You see, council starts in June, still up to mid-August, the emperor is very hostile to Cyril. But then he was subject to Cyril's allies, and consisting of bishops who happened to be in Constantinople, and also of a very powerful monastic phalanx of monastic leaders in the city who had a large popular following. They were successfully lobbied by Cyril's side and supported Cyril, and they organized some great demonstrations in mid-August in Constantinople, and that finally persuaded the emperor that he'd have to abandon Nestorius. And Nestorius is then told he has to go into retirement. There's still some time, but the emperor is still reluctant to. He declared the two suspended in early August. The emperor is reluctant to let Cyril off, But Cyril managed to escape from Ephesus, go back in a ship to Egypt, and the emperor threw in the towel. He just had to accept that Cyril was going to remain in office.
Talking about Nestorius, I have to ask the question, was Nestorius really a Nestorian?
Well. I mean, what do I mean by Nestorian? Now, of course, what Cyril of Alexandria accused Nestorius of was not believing that Christ is God. He's simply an inspired man, like the prophets. Now, and that later on, this becomes the standard view. People in later, already by Chalcedon, of course, there's some Syrians who are not very happy with this, but they don't make a great fuss about it. But really, from now on, Cyril is the the voice of Christological orthodoxy, and Nestorius is condemned for denying that Christ is God. Now, of course, modern historians, looking at what we have of Nestorius's writing, which is enough, really, to say this is not fair on him, and also that the Syrian bishops were not condemned as heretics, and the fact is that Nestorius' teaching was shared by the Syrians. They shared this understanding. We can't say that Christ was the one who was born, that Christ was suffered on the cross, and so forth, but they all affirmed this union, this coming together of manhood in Godhead in Christ. And that's still what is taught at Chalcedon. As I said to you already, Chalcedon didn't go the whole way with Cyril, with making the divine Christ, the one subject in Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I'm kind of curious. What would you say was some of the definitions of the council? What exactly did it define in the way of doctrine?
No. It still is said by people who ought to know better. I mean, a lot of people have no reason to know better. Why should they have studied, worked through the Acts? I mean, if you want to see what did the council actually define, when I say the council, we're talking really of the majority council under Cyril's leadership. What did they define in the way of doctrine? Well, you have to read through the documents, and you can read them through as I have from beginning to end, and that they didn't issue a single doctrinal decree. Now, you still find people writing articles and books that affirm, as if it was a bit of common knowledge, that the Council of Ephesus defined that Our Lady is Theotokos, God-bearer or Mother of God. This is still absolutely standard, but it's just false. Now, but this isn't a modern error or invention. It starts in the 6th century, certainly by the end of the 6th century. And this was because by then, as they were sorting out the various councils, it was agreed as a criteria for an ecumenical council that it must have ruled on doctrine. It's not enough for it to have made some disciplinary decisions or issued church canons. And so they had to find something, because Ephesus was by now recognized as the 3rd ecumenical council. They had to find something it had defined. Because it condemned Nestorius, not specific. I mean, what's Nestorius condemned for? He was deposed, but the decree deposing him didn't say what he was deposed for.
Okay.
Now, this is typical of church councils, that you just condemn somebody. Because if you condemn him for something specific, you're allowing opportunities for appeals, and Lord knows what else. So you don't just condemn the chap. Now, in that same session that condemned him, there was a reading out of a fascinating anthology of extracts from Nestorius, chosen to give the impression that Nestorius denied that, as I've already said, that Christ God, the second person of the Trinity, was the subject of the person in the human experience of Christ. But it did not. None of these extracts talk about Theotokos. Now, Nestorius had earlier on criticized the title of Theotokos, but months before the council, John of Antioch this is quite interesting. John of Antioch, to begin with, was agreeing with Nestorius that the term Theotokos is a dubious novelty. But then he changed his mind, and that was after a meeting of Syrian bishops together, including the very learned Theodoret of Cyrus. Theodoret of Cyrus, who was basically on Nestorius' side, he would have been the one, with his very wide learning, would have pointed out that already in the 4th century, a number of fathers had used the term Theotokos. It wasn't seen as controversial. So by the Council of Ephesus, everybody's accepting Theotokos. And in that sense, well, did they need a decree? Well, they could still have issued one, even if everybody agreed, to be a way of getting at Nestorius, because some people still saying he rejects Theotokos. But the reason, we have to surmise in a way, but the reason occurs to me is this. One thing that Nestorius and his supporters were accused of was of a campaign in Asia Minor to convert quartodecimans. Do you remember that rather early heresy that treated Easter separately, and for that reason has separated from the mainstream church and become a bit odd by standards of later Orthodoxy? Now, Nestorius sent some agents to receive some of these people, doubtless under pressure, back into the mainstream Orthodox Catholic Church. And the creed that they were made to sign and agree to was a very long paraphrase of the creed composed by Theodore of Mopsuestia, who was the greatest. I mean, he died a few years before the council, but he was the greatest, really, of the Antiochian theologians. And so when Cyril's council declares you must, in its what later got called Canon 7 of Ephesus, that you must stick to the Creed of Nicaea, not add anything. Right. See, that was a motive. They didn't want to mess that up by adding themselves new doctrinal decrees. They insisted were pure Nicenes. That, I think, must be the reason that they didn't issue a definition of Mary as being the Theotokos.
Yeah, so on that point, I have to then ask, okay, so did the council intend to make the creed irreformable for all times? And this is, of course, something that comes up later on at the Council of Florence, and really even earlier. So was that the intention of Ephesus?
Well, of course, as you know, the original Nicene Creed, as it was still being used by Cyril, the Egyptians, and the one that is used at their council, didn't have an article on the Holy Spirit. Because it wasn't, the original Nicene Creed wasn't a complete creed. It was simply condemning Arius over Christology. So after its very important and innovative clauses about Christ, it then says, and in the Holy Spirit, full stop. And then it gives a serious anathemas against Christological heresy. Voltaire rather naughtily said, the Nicene Creed treats the Holy Spirit very cavalierly. Now, by the end of the 4th century, in Constantinople, a new version of the Creed had appeared that added what was surely needed, an article on the Holy Spirit. A very cautious one. It restricts itself to biblical expressions, so it doesn't say the Holy Spirit is consubstantial with Father and Son. So if you kept absolutely strictly to this canon of Ephesus, saying you must add nothing to the Nicene Creed, well, the creed we all use, the Creed of Constantinople with this article on the Holy Spirit would seem ruled out. But I think, that wouldn't quite be fair, because the fact is that people were ready to accept that there were variant versions of the creed, on condition you kept the essential parts about Christ's full Godhead. The wording of the rest, people didn't make a fuss about additions. As regards the later debate, yes, you see, what about adding the filioque? Well, and of course, the Easterners like saying this is improper to make such an addition without an ecumenical council. But as I said, you see already, I mean, the original article of the Holy Spirit was itself an unauthorized addition and was accepted as such. But now this does get on to one very fundamental issue about councils. I mean, where does supreme authority lie in the church? Now, the Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox, have attributed unique authority to ecumenical councils. Now, what was the part of Rome at these councils? Well, Rome was virtually always represented. Councils where it wasn't represented, such as the and iconoclast Council 754, that called itself ecumenical, but fortunately even Byzantium later rejected that. But our 7 ecumenical councils, Rome, not really, scarcely present at Nicaea, the very first council, 325, Nicaea 1, but afterwards Rome is always represented, and there it sends along legates. Now this is very striking. When what were then become accepted as the key definitions of the faith have been agreed between Eastern bishops and Roman legates representing the popes. Isn't this a lovely evidence of a happy union in the church? It's no question yet of the divisions caused later, fierce debates over papal claims, etc., etc. This is a model for us. And Pope Benedict XVI made remarks about, I know there's difficulties in our relations now. If we get back to the first 1,000 years, the period of the great councils, when we all happily work together, wouldn't that solve things? Well, it wouldn't, because already at this date, there were very big differences over the question of supreme authority. The Roman legates and the popes, most markedly from the time of Leo I, at the time of Chalcedon onwards, were quite definite that the supreme authority in the church lies with the heir of St. Peter, that his teaching has full authority, that it does not need to be confirmed by an ecumenical council. Now, their legates at these ecumenical councils always made that clear. Now, you may say, why didn't the Byzantines object? Well, they were sensible people. If you're meeting together with representatives of the popes and you want together to approve the veneration of images or definition of Christ in 2 natures or 2 wills, this isn't the moment to start saying that you object to what the Romans are saying about authority. The Byzantines are perfectly happy. They never said, we agree that Rome has this unique authority. They're perfectly happy to, together with the legates, to draw up and issue these definitions. Now, in the East, these definitions of councils have unique authority because the emperor, who is God's representative on earth, publishes them. In the West, they have authority because the Pope puts his stamp on them. So it's a fascinating example, and makes me feel, as regards modern ecumenical dialogue, it's probably a mistake, I think, to try and reach some sort of agreement about the role of the Pope in a theoretically reunited church. The great way which we should be working together is practically on particular issues coming together, issuing joint statements on questions of morality, some as Christian doctrine, world affairs. And if Rome and Constantinople would come together in that way, that would restore the degree of unity that there was in these earlier centuries.
So does that mean that the Eastern Fathers at these councils knew that Rome maintained this view of authority, but they were just kind of happy to let it slide?
The papal legates were quite open about this. At Chalcedon, they produced the tome of Leo and insisted on its authority. Now, the Eastern bishops, they sort of had to discuss, they had to sort of vote on it, you might say. No, I don't want to get. Obviously, the Roman legates are sometimes it's more sort of pronounced and open than it is later. I mean, if you go to the Council of bit after later, 879 to 80 in Constantinople, that restored Photius. Now, Photius has been declared by a council 10 years before. This council meets to vindicate Photius, and the Roman legates attended. The Roman condemned Photius. The Roman legates attended to say, Rome has decided to forgive Photius and reinstate him, and they wanted the Easterners to agree to it. And the Easterners said, look, we reinstated him years ago. We're not going to reinstate him now. We're not going to accept your dictate on this. But still, the essential thing was both sides agree that they accept Photius as patriarch. So that they managed this really quite well. They agreed. There wasn't a common agreement where exactly authority lies in the church. But as long as Christians of East and West and the emperor were reading from the same hymn sheet, differences about exactly where authority lies, where precedence lies, that could be put to the one side.
Yeah. It's curious though, because it sounds like you're saying the West had this understanding of authority, in the papacy. The East had this understanding of authority in the emperor. Today, when it comes to ecumenical discussions, we don't have an emperor anymore.
Well,
so
no.
I kind of wonder upon what basis does East and West find unity?
Course, emperors, they do, with these major councils, the whole point is they do act through the bishops. Some decree of definition is made, which the bishops all have to sign. So, but still, if you look at the history, how these councils were managed, Chalcedon is a particularly striking example. I must say, in one way, imperial role was very helpful, because without it, sometimes East and West would not have come together. Now, take the Council of Chalcedon. They want to produce a Christological definition. And they produced a committee under the Patriarch of Constantinople, produced a draft, which talked of Christ being from two natures. Now, the Romans didn't like that, because they felt there's a danger here from, out of, as if the difference between the two was somehow blurred or lost. So they preferred the expression in two natures. And so the emperor's representatives, highest officials, told the Greek bishops, yes, well, look, we must replace in the draft from two natures to in two natures. And the bishops protested strongly. They said they refused to. So what did they do? Well, there was a brief adjournment of a few hours while a number of them went across the Bosphorus to consult the emperor. And they got a message back from the emperor saying, either agree to in two natures and dropping from two natures, or I'll end this council and we'll have another ecumenical council in Italy. It was absolutely clear dictation to the Eastern bishops. And the Eastern bishops gave way. Why did they give way? Well, obviously, if into natures was manifestly heretical, they wouldn't have given way. They wouldn't have been allowed to dictate it was manifestly heretical. When it came to a wording that would, please the emperor and the pope, and which they could interpret as, in a way, whatever way they liked, they were ready to go along with that. And of course, they did recognize that the emperor is God's anointed one.
Yeah.
And this is terribly important. It happens again and again in these councils. I said they're lovely examples of East and Western bishops meeting together, although they don't agree on where supreme authority lies in the church. But these councils would not have been possible if you did not have emperors in Constantinople who wanted to bring the whole church together.
Yeah.
Now, politics entered in to some extent, Emperor Marcian, 451, was a usurper in the West. He wanted to be recognized in the East, usurper. He wanted to be recognized in the West, so he wanted Roman backing. So this was a bit of a, quid pro quo. Later, and then, of course, the Byzantine Empire has an interest in trying to hold, the disparate parts of the Roman Empire together. He wants to find some theological agreement. But it's quite false, though, to say that the emperors were simply thinking about politics, because they believed that their success of their rule depended on divine favor. And they would only secure divine favor if they preserved the unity of the church.
One last question there about papal authority at Ephesus. What was the reaction of the council fathers to the papal legate Philip at the council? explicitly what he said
Yes,
to
well,
the council. Yeah, how
yes,
did they
well, right. I
react
mean,
to
he did
that?
make remarks about. I can't remember the exact wording of it. He did make remarks quite clearly expressed Rome's view of its supreme authority.
Right.
But I say the bishops, Cyril and his bishops, took the sensible path. Since the Romans were ready to accept the decisions of the Cyrilline Council, they just didn't respond. They didn't comment on these claims made by the Roman legates. They took rather, a matter of form coming from Rome. They feel they have to say this, and they go back to Rome. They want to say, we stood up for Pope's authority. But they knew that in the actual context of the council, Rome and Alexandria were in alliance, and this wasn't the time to start having awkward debates about, hierarchy in the church.
Mm. Let's shift gears here and speak a little bit about devotion to the Virgin Mary. So was the council, would you say that it was a major spur to the development of Marian devotion?
Now, I have to say, many people know a lot more than I do about developments through the 5th century about Marian devotion. But my impression is that there wasn't it cost made a contribution. I mean, the term calling Mary Theotokos was already used, but they're not all that widely, but used in the 4th century, and people didn't question it. I think it probably is true that after Ephesus, because even though the Acts of the Council don't make a thing about a particular thing, and its list of heresies of Nestorius of the heretical passages don't include one about the Theotokos, but that Nestorius had earlier on, though we criticized the title, this did become widely known, and this did provide a spur. So there's a great use of the term Theotokos of Ephesus, and I think this will have helped the spread of Marian devotion. But and of course, the Church of the Mary Majors in Rome is dedicated to Our Lady not that long after the Council. But after all, the cathedral in Ephesus, where Cyril's party and Memnon of Ephesus met together, that already was dedicated to Our Lady. And I think I find very striking is that at Chalcedon, when the draft definition was produced, some of the bishops pointed out, this definition doesn't say that Our Lady is Theotokos. Now, it didn't. Now, why? It can only have been an accident. Everybody accepted Theotokos by 451. If it wasn't there in the draft, it can only mean that it wasn't yet regarded as being of central importance. And they did, of course, add it. But you see, that's a bit of a pointer. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence for a very considerable increase in Marian devotion and dedication of churches to Our Lady, in Constantinople above all, in the 6th century. That is quite clearly a period of very considerable increase in promotion of Marian devotion. And then in Byzantium, key in the 7th century is, of course, these Arab invasions. And Constantinople was besieged on more than one occasion. And the city entrusted itself to Mary's protection. And the fact that then they got through safe and sound, that was a huge spur to the cult of the Virgin as the protector of the empire. So it's a gradual process. I'm sure Ephesus helped it a bit. It's a mistake to say. Well, of course, it didn't define that Mary is the Mother of God. So it wasn't some sort of great formal decree to spur things. I'm sure it helped the development along, but it takes time. Because after all, you see, the development of the cult of the saints in the 4th century had been centered on martyrs. And then they were supplemented by a few holy men, by St. Athanasius. But for quite a time, St. Thecla was, there's more evidence of cult of St. Thecla to Our Lady, because she had been a martyr. So it requires a bit of a process for the cult of Our Lady really to develop as a central thing in Christianity.
I do want to ask a brief follow-up on that. Also, while I'm waiting on everybody to send chat questions, I see a few so far, but if y'all can send some more, make sure to send them to @reason and theology. So you're saying that the council did not necessarily explicitly issue a definitive, definition on the Theotokos, or the doctrine of Mary being the Theotokos, but you would still say it considered it binding, correct?
Well, by the time of the council, there's no disagreement over Mary being Theotokos. This is shared by the Syrian-led council, rival council. It's shared with Cyril's council. There doesn't have to be debate over that as a contentious issue. The title is universally accepted. Quite a recent development. As I say, John of Antioch, just shortly before the council, was questioning it, and he needed to be pointed out to him by, fortunately, the leading Syrian theologian Theodoric, that it was a traditional title, and that was accepted. So I say, saying that Great Ephesus defined Our Lady's Theotokos. That is a development in the 6th, perhaps the late 6th century. The early 7th I found it for is in a council synopsis, a sort of brief summary account of all the councils written about 600, which says this. Yes, the council defined that Mary is Theotokos, but strictly speaking, being perhaps a bit pedantic, there wasn't such a decree.
Let me ask this question from the chat, but like I said, as a reminder to everyone, go ahead and put your questions in there. Make sure to send them to @reason and theology. I only see one so far. This one is from Unum Sanctum Catholicum. He asks, what does Father Price think where Eastern Orthodox are wrong on the papacy in the first millennium? Thank you for the great show. God bless you. So do you think that they were wrong on the papacy in the first millennium?
Now look, there I am, Roman Catholic priest, and of course I accept the papal authority in the Roman Catholic communion. It's been, I mean, there've been popes and popes, and some of them one rather regrets. But it's immense strength in Roman Catholicism that we do have a leader who can speak for the whole church and who can intervene in some cases to suppress. Well, it's not always. Sometimes popes have condemned or shouldn't have been condemned, but he is a great voice of unity, and so I mean, I think it's the position of the Pope. I don't doubt it for a moment, but as regards doctrine of papal infallibility, frankly, the doctrine of now Catholics are meant to hold that all the Pope's formal definitions as a Pope are infallible. But that isn't the case. If I asked an informed Catholic what definitions, formal definitions of the issued by the Pope are infallible, they'd say, well, the Immaculate Conception in 1854, and then the Assumption. What about all the earlier papal rulings? Oh, they weren't intended to be infallible. They were. Frequently, popes laid down with the full authority of St. Peter that this or that and that is the case. Why have these papal utterances not been collected together? I mean, they have been. There's a splendid Denzinger collection full of papal pronouncements, but some of which, of course, now look rather dated. But why have people not said, if we held the popes have always been infallible, what were their infallible pronouncements? Why has this not been done? I think the reason is that although people say we hold as doctrine the Pope is infallible, that's not really what was recognized as achieved by the First Vatican Council. What it was doing was setting up a papal absolute monarchy, which has its advantages and also possibly some disadvantages. So I'm the last person to say the Eastern Orthodoxy ought to accept a papal infallibility.
And I think you raise a good point, and that's why I argue that there are many more definitions made by popes than just the mere two that some have listed. In fact, I think that it's untenable to say that there's only two papal infallibly taught teachings. And I think Pope Leo.
What people say, I think people as regards earlier papal pronouncements, I don't think people say, just see, the Pope said this, that settles it. No, they would look at the whole tradition of the church that's been handed down, and they'd refer to papal pronouncements such as the great tome of Pope Leo as being very valuable and doctrines of weighty authority. But it's not simply Rome has spoken, this settles everything. It's a sense that down the centuries the popes have articulated what is the common faith of Catholics.
This is from Ariel Gonzalez. Did Cyril believe that Celestine had the authority to definitively excommunicate Nestorius and had jurisdiction to do it, and there was no need for a council, therefore?
Oh, gosh. No.
Gotcha.
I don't think that Cyril or generally the Eastern bishops from the 4th century onwards recognize that the Pope himself has the authority to excommunicate or depose. No, they did not recognize papal authority of jurisdiction in the Eastern provinces.
This one is from Gabra. He asks, can the non-challenge given to Legate Philip's statement be taken as a tacit admission that the East viewed the Western view on the Pope as the head of the faith as orthodox?
Is it tacit admission the East view with Eastern view on the Pope? Is that just the East? Well, the East agreed that the Pope is the number one bishop, and that his words have weight. But you do not find in the East the idea Roma locuta est, causa finita est. The Pope has spoken, that settles the matter. Though they did not recognize. Take the tome of Pope Leo. Now, that circulated in the West, where soon as Marcion becomes emperor in 450, and bishops meet together in Syria and also in Constantinople and acclaim and approve it. Now, people are not saying the Pope's spoken, that's it, that settles it. No, if it was to be accepted in the Eastern Church, this required Eastern bishops coming together and giving it their approval.
I think we cleared out the questions. There's one about Chalcedon. That's a little off topic. So in fact, we did a video on Chalcedon. This was from Ariel. So maybe go and check that video out, because I think we answered that one. I don't see any others. Any concluding thoughts on maybe something that we did not have the chance to touch on when it comes to the Council of Ephesus that you wanted to get out there?
Gosh.
And offhand, and that's okay if there aren't
anything that I sent you that we haven't.
I think.
One thing we haven't talked about, have we? We have talked about the content of it. The Canon of Ephesus that decreed that no creed was to be used save the Nicene. Yes. Now, there's a curiosity about this, because we have records of sessions, brief accounts of the sessions held both by Cyril's council and by the rival Syrian one. We've got not complete by any manner of means, but the matters that were really important and debated and circulated, we know about them. But there are just two sessions of the council where there are what purport to be a complete record. One is the first meeting of the council that deposed Nestorius. Now, we know that that meeting went on for the whole day, because we hear the reference in a letter afterwards to lamps being lit, towards the evening. The bishops are still debating. Now, we got a record of those, but it's quite long, but it couldn't have filled the whole day. So what is there is selected material, selected by Cyril and his team as a bit of propaganda to send to Constantinople. It doesn't mention the fact that the imperial representative turned up at the beginning of the session and told the bishops they had no business meeting before the Syrians had arrived. But they said, "I'm sure of that." And he said, "Yes, the emperor's instructions. Can you read us the emperor's instructions?" He reads them out, and the bishop said, "Oh, that's it. Councils begin with a reading of the emperor's instructions. You've read the instructions, so the council is opened," and threw him out, had him removed from the chamber. You see, so that's a bit curious. Now, the other session, which purports to be substantial, is a session a month later that issued that. We've already discussed it, that canon, saying that only the Nicene Creed could be used. Now, this is a very odd document because it consists of a series of documents very clumsily cobbled together. And where there are some remarks by spokesmen for one side or the other, they're largely taken from the session of June the 22nd. So it scarcely attempts to be a proper record of a session. And also this decree stressing the authority of Nicaea and implicitly condemning, I referred to the Theodore of Mopsuestia, a leading antiquene who issued a much longer creed, sufficiently implicitly condemning that. Now, we hear nothing about this for a whole year. Now, if this session had taken place, there would have been a reaction to it from the Syrians. No reaction at all. So it's beginning to look that the whole session is a concoction of a year later.
Wow.
It's a very curious, this is a very curious thing to happen with, consider, one's got to be, reading Conciliar Acts, they very rarely give you a complete procès-verbal, a complete record of everything that was said in the way that, I know what you have in America. In England, we have Hansard's famous, reports what all the MPs have said. They sometimes improve when MPs speak with a bit of slang or their grammar goes a bit haywire, they'll mend that, but otherwise it's a verbatim record. Now, we just don't have that for the ecumenical councils. A possible exception, I think, being what we call the Eighth Council of 869 to 70, that does, to my reading through with a very critical eye, it does read very plausibly as a pretty complete record. But otherwise, what gets published is selective. Sometimes, of course, to suppress, reduce the amount of not publicizing disagreement. So, Chalcedon 451, they produce this definition, and this session, the fifth session, must be the key one where this was debated. Well, none of that debate is included in the record, which is very short. Only a few pages. Clearly, they didn't want to mention the fact that a number of bishops have spoken critically of the draft, because that would be used by opponents of the council. So that is hushed up. So one has to be aware, reading Conciliar Acts, that they're a selective record. Intended, of course, to convey authentically what the council had decreed, but they're not, of course, they're more than just a sort of brief bit of propaganda for wide circulation, because, how many people read these records? Ephesus now and Chalcedon were read a lot in the 6th century because of great debate, over the 3 chapters and that sort of thing. But on the whole, the Acts, they're halfway between official minutes that get simply filed away in a cabinet somewhere and simple publicity to be widely circulated. They're slightly there's a bit of a halfway point between those two, and a reader of Acts has to be aware of the extent to which they have been tidied up and a greater degree of uniformity is introduced than was probably the case. Though there, if I may say, well, the role of the emperor, Chalcedon is extraordinarily frank in its first session about disagreement expressed. And at the end, it declared Dioscorus and half a dozen other leading bishops in the East deposed. And this was a decree made, a judgment made by the lay chairman presiding over the session. The bishops weren't asked. So here we find a council that, so far from hiding the fact that the emperor is dictating to the bishops actually makes a point of stressing it. Because the bishops, they felt disgraced themselves at Ephesus too, a few years before, you see, condemning Flavian of Constantinople. So this fact I've mentioned already, the emperor's playing a major role, and one that did not cause him embarrassment, because it was felt that the emperors are there as God's appointed ones. And as I've said, it was a great value. It greatly aided Christian unity in this period. The fact that however much bishops might disagree, the emperor was the person who above all had a responsibility for holding the church together and assuring that God's people would continue to enjoy God's favor. I said, in the modern ecumenical context, well, I'd love to see more dialogue, more collaboration between Rome and Constantinople. But of course, there isn't an emperor to press for that. One might hope, I think, that public opinion might impress on both Rome and Constantinople that if the leaders of the Christian world were more often to speak together, this would add weight.
Yeah. I want to ask one follow-up question there. Last question. It does seem like, okay, in some cases there wasn't frank discussion and legitimate debate at some of these councils, and it was more kind of the dictate of the emperor that, determined the outcome of some of the sessions. But how then would we respond to people who say, well, there wasn't frank discussion at these councils, therefore their decisions are illegitimate?
Well, if you want to, this can only be the voice of the whole church if all the bishops who sign are happy with it. Well, good gosh, how could you determine to what extent that was true? The essential thing is that what is very important is that at the end of the council, all the bishops sign in agreement.
Okay.
It wasn't like a modern parliamentary debate.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like meetings of the Senate, where a Roman Senate, a matter would be proposed, and all the senators in turn could speak and could make counter proposals. It was a very open. Now, the ecumenical councils worked differently. There would be discussion, certainly, and then, however, a single decision, decree, it might be a longish document, it might be a very brief decision, would be presented by the chairman or the chairmen in the plural. What we call Cyril's council, he was the leading figure, if you like, but there were half a dozen senior bishops who also, as were, shared the chairing with him. They would produce a proposal, and then the bishops spoke in turn by seniority. So, and what was not possible once the senior bishop, we don't quite. There are a number of chairmen working together at Ephesus. If you go on to Chalcedon, the senior bishop is the Pope's representative, Pascasinus of Lilybaeum. Now, what he would do, he would get a discussion going, and then at the end of it, to pull things together, he'd make a judgment. And after he'd made that judgment, the other bishops were not free to express disagreement. They might suddenly decide to flee the chamber or something, but they couldn't vote against it. And this could occasionally lead to awkwardness. But generally speaking, the chairman was sensible. He was aware that, look, everyone's got to agree to it, so I mustn't say something controversial. So what constitutes the voice of the council is the fact that its decrees are signed by all the bishops present, by full unanimity.
Do you, when it comes, I said there was going to be, that was the last question, but I had one more now that I thought of. When you mentioned that the emperor was kind of God's man, he was seen to be God's man by the emperor and many of the bishops. Well, since we don't have an emperor anymore, does that mean that they were wrong? God chose in his providence that they were wrong? Or could it be the case that even though we don't have an emperor today, in fact, the emperor back then in these councils was God's man and God was using him?
Gosh.
Yeah.
If we consider the essential role played by the emperor in maintaining the unity of the Christian world, well, perhaps I could say one more thing about sometimes the East couldn't care less whether the West agrees with it or not. Sometimes it is more concerned. Rome, I think, is always keen to have orthodoxy and good discipline by Roman standards accepted in the East, because they want, Roman doctrine and Roman discipline to be, widely spread. Something very similar throughout the church. There was a recognition of that need for unity, and as I say, God's instrument in maintaining this unity throughout the period of the ecumenical councils was the emperor. So, if we accept that these councils being agreed to by the church, churches West and East, if this is God's will, surely we have to then to recognize that the way God achieved his will was by setting up Christian emperors and endowing them with this worldwide authority, which it continues extraordinarily. In about 1400, the question, Christianity was flourishing in Russia, and the ruler in Moscow made references to, he said, we have a church, we don't have an emperor. Because Byzantine emperor by now, what did he rule? Constantinople, a very small bit of ground around it, and small parts of Greece. And the Patriarch of Constantinople wrote to the Ivan of Moscow to say, but look, this is wrong. You can't say we have one church but not one emperor. There is one emperor who is appointed by God. Now, he doesn't say he's the ruler, he should be the ruler of the whole world. He does say he's the head of all Christians. And this he insists on. He doesn't say the Patriarch of Constantinople has got unique authority in the church. It's the emperor who still is appointed by God as the leader of all Christians. So I think if you combine the length of time in which this, as long as it could be held on to, of course, 1453, emperors disappear, and you recognize the way the church benefited from having a Christian emperor. Of course, there were times, the iconoclast controversy when Byzantine emperors enforced iconoclasm on part of the church, but that was only for several decades. But basically, I think we can see the role of the emperor was a hugely valuable one, and if there hadn't been emperors, there wouldn't have been ecumenical councils.
Yeah, good point there. Thank you so much for coming on, Father Price. This was really, really excellent and very helpful. I appreciate you taking your time out to answer all of these questions. You're always welcome back on the show.
Well, I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak on these matters so dear to my heart, and I hope that what I say is Yes, I can't quite resist sometimes slightly sort of knocking on the head what I regard as traditional errors. But the great thing is, well, I've been working for 20 years now producing these
Right.
translations of Acts, and rather heavy going, you might find some of them, but they're, if you're interested, go back to the sources. And
Yeah.
Ephesus is a very exciting story. It's not just bishops in council; it's a whole Christian world that is involved, and it's such an eye opener to how churches operated, how politics operated, how public opinion was made use of, the balance of power between bishops, monks, crowds. You once introduced to an absolutely fascinating world that was a world shaped by divine providence in order to produce these doctrines that we still live by.
Right. Thanks so much for coming on. Everybody go and get a copy. I put a link of it in the description. The Council of Ephesus 431, big giant tome here. I love it. It's good stuff. Again, go and get a copy. We'll see y'all later. Oh, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right. God bless.